The wind came down off the ridge like God's own punishment, carrying snow so thick Elias could barely see his own hands gripping the reins. The mule, stubborn, half-blind, meaner than sin, balked at the edge of the trail, and Elias didn't blame her. Any creature with sense would have turned back 2 miles ago. But the telegram in his coat pocket said a woman was arriving on the afternoon stage, and that meant he had to be in town whether the mountain wanted to kill him or not. He'd stopped expecting anything 3 brides ago, maybe 4. They all blurred together after a while, the hope, the horror, the hasty departure. The pattern never changed. They'd arrive with trunks full of dreams and dresses that wouldn't survive a week of Wyoming dirt. They'd see the cabin, see him, see what 6 years alone on a frozen ridge does to a man. And then they'd see the stagecoach schedule. Elias Vance was 34 years old and looked 50. His face was a roadmap of old breaks and older scars, the kind you get from horses, weather, and one spectacularly bad decision involving a land deed and a man who didn't honor contracts. His hands were cracked leather wrapped around bone. His voice, when he bothered using it, came out rust and gravel, unused and unwelcome. The town of Clearwater Junction squatted in the valley like something ashamed of itself, 23 buildings and a church that hadn't seen a preacher in 2 years. Elias tied the mule outside Dalton's general store and stood in the storm, waiting. The stagecoach was late. It was always late. "She ain't coming, Vance." Elias didn't turn. He knew that voice. Morton Hayes, the telegrapher, a man whose primary joy in life was delivering bad news with a smile. "Stage got delayed in Prospect. Driver sent word they're holding till morning. Weather's too rough." "Fine. Could have saved yourself a ride if you'd checked with me first." "Could have." Elias started toward his mule. "That's 9, ain't it?" Hayes called after him. "9 women you sent for?" Elias kept walking. "Hell of a thing, Vance. Hell of a thing, wanting something that bad and never getting it." The mule stamped, impatient. Elias swung into the saddle and turned her toward the ridge. The storm swallowed them both in seconds. 12. He didn't come back to town the next day. Or the day after that. The woman, whoever she was, whatever desperate circumstances had convinced her to answer an ad from a stranger offering marriage and a homestead in exchange for work, could damn well wait. If she was real at all. The last 2 hadn't even existed, just schemes by the matrimonial agency to collect his deposit fees. Elias spent those days splitting wood because firewood didn't judge you, didn't ask questions, didn't leave. The cabin sat in a clearing his grandfather had carved out of nothing back when Wyoming was still a territory, and men could claim land just by being stubborn enough to stay on it. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace that drew smoke like it was supposed to about half the time, and windows so small you could defend the place against an army if you were stupid enough to need to. 8 women had walked into this cabin. 8 women had walked out. The first one, Margaret, from Philadelphia, had lasted 6 hours. She'd taken one look at the dirt floor, the gaps in the walls where the chinking had failed, and the basin of freezing water he'd offered for washing up, and she'd started crying. Not the gentle, delicate tears of a woman disappointed. The full-body, hiccuping sobs of someone realizing they'd made a catastrophic mistake. He'd driven her back to town in silence. The second one made it 3 days. The third, a week. The fourth had seemed promising. Clara from Ohio, strong-backed and practical. But then wolves had gotten into the chickens one night, and she'd seen Elias shoot 2 of them at close range. She'd been on the stage by noon. After that, he'd stopped trying to make the cabin welcoming, stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was. A hard place for hard living, and if you couldn't take it, there was no shame in leaving. Except there was shame. His. On the 3rd day after the storm, Elias rode back to town. The sky had cleared to that painful blue you only get at altitude, and the cold was clean and knife-sharp. The mule picked her way down the trail with the confidence of an animal who'd made this trip 100 times. Clearwater Junction looked no better in sunshine. The main street was a frozen ribbon of mud, and the few people out gave Elias the same looks they always did. Half pity, half curiosity, like he was a creature from a cautionary tale. He went to the telegraph office first. Hayes looked up from his newspaper with that same knowing smile. "She's here." "Where?" "Dalton's been putting her up. Been here 2 days, Vance. 2 days she's been waiting for you to show." "Storm. Storm was 3 days ago." Elias turned to leave. She ain't what you're expecting, Hayes called after him. That made Elias pause. How's that? Hayes shrugged. You'll see. Dalton's general store occupied the largest building in town, which wasn't saying much. The front half sold supplies. The back half served as an informal boarding house for travelers who didn't mind sleeping on a cot between sacks of grain. Elias pushed through the door, and the bell above it announced him with a cheerful jangle that felt obscene. There were 3 people inside. Jack Dalton behind the counter, his wife Vera sorting through a shipment of canned goods, and a woman sitting on a barrel near the stove. She wasn't looking at him. She was reading a book, so absorbed she didn't even glance up when he walked in. Vance! Dalton's voice boomed with false cheer. There you are. Been wondering when you'd show up. The woman closed her book, slowly, deliberately, and looked at him. Elias had learned to read women fast. Had to, when you only got a few hours to figure out if they were going to run or stay. He looked for the tells. The way they held their shoulders, the steadiness of their gaze, whether their hands shook when they stood up. This woman didn't move at all. She was maybe 30, built like someone who'd done real work, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had mostly given up. Her dress was practical wool patched at the elbows. Her face wasn't pretty, too angular, too strong in the jaw, but her eyes were sharp and measuring, the kind that missed nothing. Elias Vance? Her voice was low, level, Eastern accent, but softened by time. That's right. Hannah Cade. She stood then, and she was taller than he'd expected. Your telegram said you needed help with a homestead. Not a wife, not a partner. Help with a homestead. That's right, he said again. You're late. Storm. Storm was 3 days ago. She said it the same way Hayes had, but without the smugness. Just fact. Dalton cleared his throat. Miss Cade's been real patient, Vance, helping Vera with inventory, earning her keep, but I imagine she's eager to see the place. I imagine. Elias looked at Hannah. You understand what you signed up for? Your ad said homestead, hard work, winter conditions. I can read. Reading and doing are different things. I'm aware. They stood there, measuring each other. Elias waited for the moment. There was always a moment when they really saw him, saw the scars, the rough edges, the permanent dirt under his nails, saw what 6 years of isolation carved into a man. Hannah's expression didn't change. The cabin's 6 miles up the ridge, Elias said finally. No neighbors, no town visits unless the weather holds. Nearest doctor is a day's ride in good conditions. Winter lasts 7 months. You'll work from sunup to sundown, hauling water, feeding stock, chopping wood, cooking, mending. Anything breaks, we fix it. Anything dies, we bury it. It's cold, it's hard, and it doesn't get easier. All right. All right. That's what I came for. She picked up a canvas pack from beside the barrel. Are we leaving now, or do you need more time to convince me to quit? Vera Dalton made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly covered. Elias felt something unfamiliar flicker in his chest. Not hope. He'd buried that, but something adjacent to it. Curiosity, maybe. Now's fine, he said. The mule didn't like carrying 2 people. She made her displeasure known with a series of irritated snorts and a tendency to veer toward anything that might scrape her passengers off. Hannah sat behind Elias, pack across her lap, and said nothing. Didn't complain about the cold, the pace, the mule's attitude. Just sat there, steady and quiet, while the town fell away and the ridge rose up to meet them. An hour into the ride, Elias spoke. What did Hayes mean? Telegraph man said you weren't what I was expecting. What do you mean? Silence. Then, I'm not 20 and desperate. I didn't come here looking for rescue or romance. Your ad said you needed help running a homestead, and I need work. That's the arrangement. You read the part about marriage? I did. And? Seemed like a legal formality for claim purposes. Am I wrong? Elias didn't answer immediately. The truth was complicated. Yes, marriage legitimized shared claim rights, but it was also supposed to be about partnership, building something together. Except after 8 failures, he'd stopped thinking about the together part. Not wrong, he said finally. Then we'll handle the legalities when it makes sense. For now, I'm here to work. Where are you from? East? That's vague. Boston originally, but I've been west for 6 years. Worked at a boarding house in Denver, a cattle station in Nebraska, and a mining camp kitchen in the Dakotas before that. Why leave? Another pause. Same reason you sent for a mail-order bride. Sometimes starting over is easier than staying put. The answer felt true in a way that made Elias not want to push further. They all had their reasons. His, hers, everyone who ended up in places like this. Reasons they'd rather leave buried. The trail got steeper. The mule slowed, picking her way over exposed rock and frozen mud. The trees thinned out, replaced by scrub pine and patches of snow that never really melted. "This is all yours?" Hannah asked. 160 acres. My grandfather filed the claim in 68. My father worked it till he died. Then me. Alone? For 6 years. Why? The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Why had he stayed when anyone sensible would have sold out, moved on, found easier ground? Why had he kept sending for women he knew wouldn't stay? Why had he poured himself into this frozen, unforgiving piece of nothing when the world below offered 100 easier paths? Because it's mine, Elias said. Only thing that ever was. The cabin came into view just as the sun started its descent. A dark shape against darker trees, smoke threading from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before leaving. Elias felt Hannah go still behind him. Here it comes, he thought, the realization, the regret. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, not horrified. Chimney draws well, roof looks sound. Is that a root cellar? Yeah. Stock? 4 chickens, the mule, and a milk cow that's more attitude than production. Water source? Spring, quarter-mile east, runs year-round. She was quiet again, and Elias could feel her cataloging, assessing. Not judging, assessing. There was a difference. He helped her down from the mule, and she stood in the clearing, turning slowly, taking it in, the cabin, the woodpile, the empty garden plot buried under snow, the lean-to that served as a barn. It's smaller than I expected, she said. Most things are. I'll need to see the interior, check the stores, and understand the routine. If I'm going to pull my weight, I need to know what that means here. Fair enough? Elias opened the cabin door and stepped aside. Hannah walked in like she owned it. The main room was exactly what it looked like from outside. Functional, spare, cold. The fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs occupied the center, and a narrow cot sat in the far corner. Hooks on the walls held tools, clothing, and a rifle. A few shelves sagged under the weight of canned goods, sacks of flour and cornmeal, and a coffee tin that was more rust than metal. Hannah set her pack down and walked a slow circle. She ran her hand along the table, checking for stability. Crouched to inspect the fireplace, looking at the draft. Opened the small door to what passed for a pantry, taking inventory. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. "There? 1 cot." "Yeah, I'll need my own." "I can build one." "I can build my own?" That stopped him. "You know how?" She gave him a look that said the question was stupid. "I worked a cattle station. You think they had furniture delivered?" Fair point. Hannah moved to the window, such as it was, barely 2 feet square, the glass wavy and old. She looked out at the ridge falling away into darkness. "How many came before me?" Elias didn't see the point in lying. 8. How long did they last? The longest made it 3 weeks. Why'd they leave? Lots of reasons: cold, isolation, wolves, me. She turned to look at him. Which one was the real reason? All of them. None of them. Does it matter? It matters if I'm going to understand what I'm working with. Elias felt his jaw tighten. You want the truth? They left because this place is exactly what it looks like. Hard, lonely, and mean. And I'm not good at pretending it's something else. I don't know how to make people comfortable. Don't know how to talk about nothing when there's work to do. Don't know how to be anything except what 6 years alone makes you. So they came, they saw, and they made the smart choice. Which was? Leaving. Hannah studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, like he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. I'm not looking for comfort, Mr. Vance. I'm looking for work. You give me that, We'll get along fine. It's Elias. Elias, then. She picked up her pack. I'll start tomorrow. For tonight, I need to sleep. Where should I set up? He gestured to the small second room, barely more than a closet, used for storage. There. I'll clear it out. I can clear it. I know where things go. Then show me, and I'll do it. They stood there in a brief, silent standoff. Then Elias shrugged and started moving crates. They worked in silence, Elias hauling boxes, Hannah sweeping out 6 years of accumulated dust and debris. It took an hour to make the space livable, and by the time they finished, full dark had fallen, and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped enough to see your breath. Elias fed the fire while Hannah unpacked. She didn't have much: 2 changes of clothes, a wool blanket, the book he'd seen her reading, a small wooden box she didn't open, and a skinning knife in a leather sheath. You hunt? He asked, nodding at the knife. When I need to. Can you shoot? Well enough. Well enough for what? For what needs shooting? Despite himself, Elias felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. He heated up stew from the pot he'd made 3 days ago. Venison, potatoes, onions, all of it tough and under-seasoned, and they ate at the table without talking. Hannah didn't complain about the food, didn't make small talk, just ate steadily and efficiently, like someone who'd learned not to waste calories on conversation. When they finished, she washed both bowls in the bucket of water by the door, dried them, and put them back on the shelf. Routine? She asked. Up at first light, check the stock, haul water, split wood. If the weather's clear, I hunt. You'd handle the cabin, cooking, mending, keeping the fire. Chickens are temperamental. Cow needs milking twice a day, and she kicks. I've been kicked before. Not like this. We'll see. Elias almost smiled again. They stood there in the firelight, 2 strangers in a too small cabin, and for the first time in 6 years, Elias didn't feel the weight of the silence. It wasn't comfortable, not yet, but it wasn't crushing either. Why'd you really come? He asked. Truth. Hannah looked at him, her face half-shadowed. Because staying where I was would have killed me slower than this place will. At least here, if I die, it'll be because I chose the fight, not because I gave up. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in longer than he could remember. Fair enough, Elias said quietly. Hannah nodded and turned toward her room. At the doorway, she paused. Elias? Yeah? I'm not running. Whatever comes, I'm not running. She disappeared into the darkness before he could respond. Elias stood there staring at the empty doorway and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope. Still not that. But something like the memory of it. The ghost of a feeling he'd thought the mountain had killed. He banked the fire, checked the rifle, and lay down on his cot. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and howling down from the ridge like it always did. But for the first time in 6 years, Elias Vance didn't fall asleep alone. And for the first time in 6 years, he didn't wake up expecting to be. Morning came cold and blue, the kind of dawn that hurts to breathe. Elias woke to silence. No shuffling, no crying, no desperate packing. He lay there for a moment, listening, half convinced he'd dreamed the whole thing. Then he heard it. The cabin door opening and closing, quiet and deliberate. He rolled out of bed and pulled on his boots. By the time he got outside, Hannah was already at the woodpile, splitting logs with steady, efficient strikes. She'd found his spare axe, the one with the loose handle he'd been meaning to fix, and was making it work anyway. She saw him and paused mid-swing. Morning. Morning. He watched her work for a moment. Her form wasn't perfect, but it was effective. Weight behind each strike, no wasted motion. You didn't have to start already. Couldn't sleep. Might as well be useful. Elias crossed to the chicken coop. The birds were already awake, making their usual racket, and when he opened the gate, they swarmed him like he owed them money. Friendly, Hannah called over. They're monsters. Watch your fingers when you feed them. Noted. He scattered feed while Hannah finished splitting wood, and then they moved through the morning routine like dancers learning a new pattern. Awkward, uncertain, but slowly finding the rhythm. She learned where the feed was stored, how much water the cow needed, which chicken was the mean one, all of them, but especially the Rhode Island Red. The cow, Bess, though Elias rarely called her anything except the damn cow, took one look at Hannah and decided to test her. When Hannah settled onto the milking stool, Bess shifted her weight and kicked out, fast and mean. Hannah moved faster. She caught the cow's leg mid-swing and held it there, steady pressure, until Bess settled down. "Try that again, and I'll milk you dry every time," Hannah said, conversationally. "Your choice." Bess huffed, but stood still. Elias, watching from the doorway, felt that almost smile again. They worked through the morning without much talk. Hannah proved herself at every turn, quick, competent, and completely unbothered by the cold, the work, or the general hostility of the livestock. When Elias headed out to check the traps he'd set for rabbits, she asked if she could come. "Why?" he asked. "Because I need to know the land if I'm staying. Can't help if I don't know what I'm working with." It made sense, so he nodded. They hiked the eastern trail, Hannah keeping pace without complaint even when the terrain turned steep and treacherous. Elias pointed out landmarks, the split pine that marked the property line, the rocky outcrop where he'd seen a mountain lion 2 years back, the spring that fed their water supply. Hannah absorbed it all silently, filing it away. The first trap was empty. The second had a rabbit, frozen stiff overnight. Hannah watched as Elias reset it, memorizing the process. "You check these every day?" she asked. "Weather permitting." "How many do you run?" 8 spread across 2 miles, gives us meat 3-4 times a week if we're lucky. "I can help check them." "You know how to skin a rabbit?" "I know how to learn." They kept walking. The sun climbed higher, but the temperature barely shifted. This high up, warmth was a memory from another season. At the 4th trap, Hannah stopped suddenly. "What?" Elias turned. She was staring at something in the snow. Tracks, large and predatory, too big for a coyote. Wolf, maybe. Or something worse. "How close are they?" she asked. "Pack denned up about 2 miles north. They don't usually come this close unless they're hungry." "Are they hungry?" Elias looked at the tracks, measuring. "Getting there." Hannah nodded slowly. "So we need to be careful." "We need to be armed." "I am." She pulled back her coat to show the skinning knife at her belt. "That's not going to stop a wolf." "It'll slow one down long enough for me to run." "You can't outrun a wolf." "I don't have to." She looked at him, and her expression was completely serious. "I just have to outrun you." For a moment, Elias just stared. Then, against every expectation, he laughed. An actual, genuine laugh, rough from disuse, but real. Hannah's mouth quirked. Not quite a smile, but close. They finished checking the traps and headed back. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was high and pale, and Elias's stomach was reminding him they'd skipped breakfast. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Can you eat what I make?" "Depends on what you make." "Then I guess we'll find out together." Hannah could cook. Not fancy, not delicate, but solid, substantial food that filled you up and stayed with you. She made biscuits from the cornmeal stores, fried up the rabbit, and boiled coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate at the table, and this time the silence felt different. Easier. Like they were figuring out how to exist in the same space without needing to fill every moment with words. "How long are you planning to stay?" Elias asked eventually. Hannah looked up from her plate. "As long as it takes?" "As long as what takes?" "Proving you wrong." "About?" "You said I wouldn't last a week. I'm staying till you admit you were wrong." Despite everything, the cold, the isolation, the grinding certainty that this would end like all the others, Elias felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the space where hope could grow if you gave it enough time. "We'll see," he said. Hannah smiled, small, knowing, unbothered. "Yeah," she agreed. "We will." Outside, the wind picked up again, howling down from the ridge like it always did, like it always would. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Something small but significant. For the first time in 6 years, Elias Vance wasn't alone. And for the first time in 6 years, he wasn't sure that was a bad thing. The days that followed fell into a pattern, hard, relentless, but steady. They worked from dawn to dusk, learning each other's rhythms, adjusting to the reality of shared space and shared labor. Hannah proved herself again and again, taking on tasks without being asked, fixing problems before they became crises, and pushing back when Elias tried to shoulder everything himself. I'm not decoration, she told him one afternoon when he'd insisted on hauling a full water barrel alone. Either let me help or explain why you won't. He couldn't explain it, not in a way that made sense, so he let her help. She was strong, stronger than he'd expected, and relentless in a way that reminded him of the mountain itself. When the chicken coop's roof started leaking, she patched it. When the door hinge broke, she fixed it. When supplies ran low, she rationed without complaint. And she didn't run. A week passed, then 2. Elias waited for the moment she'd break, but it didn't come. Instead, something else happened. One night, 3 weeks after her arrival, they sat by the fire after dinner. Hannah was mending one of his shirts. He'd torn it on a fence post. And Elias was oiling the rifle. Your grandfather, Hannah said suddenly. What was he like? Elias looked up, surprised. Why? Because this place was his. I want to know what kind of man builds a life here. It was the first personal question she'd asked. The first time she'd shown interest in anything beyond the work. Elias set down the rifle, thinking. He was hard. Fair, but hard. Didn't talk much. Didn't suffer fools. He came west because he didn't fit anywhere else, and he stayed because he was too stubborn to quit. Sounds familiar? He died the winter I turned 20. Heart gave out while he was splitting wood. Found him frozen in the snow the next morning. I'm sorry. Don't be. He lived exactly how he wanted. Can't ask for more than that. Hannah nodded, stitching quietly. Then, my father was a drunk. Beat my mother till she stopped fighting back. Then beat me when she wasn't enough. I left when I was 16 and never looked back. Elias went still. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was reciting a grocery list, but the weight of it hung in the air. That why you keep moving? He asked carefully. Part of it. Mostly I move because staying puts you in people's debt, and I don't like owing anyone anything. You don't owe me. Not yet. She tied off the thread and held up the shirt, inspecting her work. But if I stay long enough, I will. That's how it works. Doesn't have to. She looked at him then, really looked, like she was trying to figure out if he meant it. We'll see, she said finally, echoing his words from weeks before. They sat there in the firelight, 2 damaged people in a hard place, and something unspoken settled between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it, the foundation of something that might, if they were careful, become real. Outside, the wolves howled in the distance, and the mountain wind screamed its endless warnings. But inside, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither of them was alone. And that, for now, was enough. The first real storm hit on Hannah's 28th day. Elias saw it coming from miles out, a wall of gray-black cloud rolling over the peaks like something alive and angry. He'd been checking the trap line when the wind shifted, carrying that particular smell that meant snow, heavy and mean. We need to get back, he told Hannah, who was skinning the rabbit they'd just pulled from the last trap. She looked up at the sky, still clear overhead, then at the approaching darkness. How long? Hour, maybe less. She had the rabbit cleaned and wrapped in under 3 minutes. They made it back to the cabin with 20 minutes to spare, which Elias used to secure everything that could blow away, and Hannah used to haul in enough firewood to last 3 days. The storm hit like a fist. One moment there was wind and the threat of snow. The next, the world disappeared behind a white wall so thick you couldn't see the woodpile 10 feet from the door. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the wind hammered the cabin like it was personally offended by its existence. They sealed the shutters, stuffed rags in the gaps around the door, and built up the fire until the stones glowed. Then there was nothing to do but wait. How long do these last? Hannah asked, standing by the window, watching the storm through the narrow gap between shutter slats. Could be hours. Could be days. Days. Last winter I was snowed in for 11 days straight. Drifts got so high I had to dig a tunnel to reach the barn. Hannah was quiet for a moment, then, did you have enough supplies? Barely. Lost 2 chickens to the cold. Would have lost the cow too if I hadn't brought her inside. Inside the cabin. Couldn't let her freeze. Hannah turned to look at him, and something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. You shared this cabin with a cow for 11 days? She's better company than some people. I don't doubt it. The wind screamed and the cabin shook, but the walls held. Elias had chinked them properly last fall, learning from the mistakes of previous winters, and the roof was solid. They'd be cold, maybe uncomfortable, but they'd survive. They ate a cold dinner, no point wasting fuel on cooking when they needed it for heat, and settled in to wait out the storm. Hannah pulled out her book, angling it toward the firelight. Elias worked on repairing a broken harness, the kind of mindless task that kept your hands busy when there was nothing else to do. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up. "What are you reading?" Elias asked eventually, more to break the silence than because he cared. Hannah held up the book so he could see the cover. "Plutarch, Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans." "That's what you brought? To Wyoming?" "Would you prefer I'd packed fashion magazines?" "I'd prefer you'd packed something useful, like a second blanket." "I did. This is it." She gestured at the book. "Gets cold enough. I can burn it for warmth." Despite the howling wind and the very real possibility they were about to freeze to death, Elias almost smiled. "You'd burn Plutarch?" "I'd burn anything if it meant not losing my fingers. Practical. Survival usually is." The fire crackled and popped. Outside, something heavy hit the side of the cabin, a branch probably, torn loose by the wind. The whole structure shuddered. Hannah didn't flinch, just kept reading. "You ever get scared?" Elias asked. She looked up. "Of what?" "This. The storms. The isolation. Being stuck on a mountain with a stranger who could be anyone." "You planning to murder me, Elias?" "No." "Then I'm not scared." She marked her place in the book with a finger. "I've been scared. Real scared, the kind that follows you into sleep and lives in your chest like a second heartbeat." "This?" She gestured at the storm. "This is just weather. Weather doesn't care about you enough to hurt you personal. It just is." "And the 8 women before me, they were scared of weather?" "They were scared of what weather represents. Helplessness. Dependence. The possibility that all the comfort they'd built their lives around could disappear in an afternoon." Hannah's voice was matter-of-fact. "I stopped being scared of that a long time ago. Can't lose what you never had." Elias studied her across the firelight. This strange, unshakable woman who'd appeared in his life like she'd been sent to prove everything he believed wrong. "What happened in Boston?" he asked quietly. Hannah's expression didn't change, but something shuddered behind her eyes. "I left. That's what happened. Before that..." She was silent long enough that Elias thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she closed the book and set it aside. "My mother died when I was 15. Pneumonia, though the doctor said it was really just giving up. My father remarried 6 months later, a woman half his age who looked at me like I was furniture she hadn't ordered. I stayed a year because I was stupid enough to think it might get better. Then one night my father came home drunk and decided I reminded him too much of my mother, and his new wife didn't stop him when he started hitting, so I left, took what I could carry, and walked out the door." She said it flatly, clinically, like she was describing someone else's life. "I worked in a textile mill for 2 years, 12-hour shifts in a building that was more fire hazard than factory. Saved every penny. When I had enough, I bought a train ticket west and kept moving until I couldn't hear Boston and people's voices anymore. Worked everywhere, learned everything, and I swore I'd never be helpless again, never be the kind of person who stays because they're too scared to leave." "That why you answered my ad?" "Part of it." "What's the other part?" Hannah looked at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw something raw in her expression, something unguarded. "Because I'm tired of running, and this..." She gestured at the cabin, the storm, the life they were building. "This feels like the kind of place you could stop, if you wanted to." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and true. Elias didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to tell her that he'd stopped believing in stopping, in staying, in anything permanent the 4th time a woman left crying. So he just nodded and went back to working on the harness. But something had shifted. Some wall between them had developed a crack. The storm raged for 2 more days. They rationed food, kept the fire small enough to conserve wood, but large enough to not freeze, and existed in a strange, enforced intimacy that would have been unbearable with anyone else. But Hannah was easy to be silent with. She didn't need conversation to fill space. didn't need reassurance or comfort or explanations. She just existed, reading, mending, occasionally standing by the window to check if the storm had broken. On the second day, Elias woke from a restless sleep to find her sitting by the fire, feeding it one careful piece of wood at a time. "You should sleep," he said. "Can't. Too cold." He sat up. The temperature had dropped further. His breath came out in visible clouds, and frost had formed on the inside of the shutters. "Fire's dying," Hannah said quietly. "We're running low on wood." Elias cursed under his breath. He'd thought they'd brought in enough, but he'd miscalculated. 2 days of constant burning had depleted their supply faster than expected. "How much is left?" he asked. "Enough for maybe 6 more hours. After that?" She didn't finish the sentence. After that, they'd freeze. Elias stood and moved to the door, peering through the gap. The storm was still raging, visibility was near zero, and the drifts had piled against the cabin walls like siege works. "I'll have to go out," he said. "You can't see 3 feet in that." "I know where the woodpile is. Straight shot, maybe 20 steps. 20 steps you could miss by 2 feet and wander off the ridge." "You have a better idea?" Hannah was quiet. Then, "We both go. Rope between us. You lead, I follow. If you lose your way, I pull you back." "Too dangerous." "More dangerous than freezing?" She had a point. They rigged a rope between them, 20 feet of hemp line that Elias normally used for hauling supplies. Hannah tied it around her waist with a knot that would hold under strain, and Elias did the same. "Stay close," he told her. "If you lose sight of me, pull twice. I'll pull back. 3 pulls means trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind we don't want." They stepped out into the storm, and the cold hit like a physical blow. Elias couldn't breathe for a moment. The air was too frozen, too sharp. Behind him, he heard Hannah gasp, but she didn't falter. He moved forward, counting steps. The wind tried to shove him sideways, and the snow was so thick he couldn't tell ground from sky. 1 step, 2, 3. At step 8, he lost his bearings entirely. The cabin disappeared. The woodpile disappeared. The world became nothing but white noise and freezing death, and for a terrible moment Elias thought they'd made a fatal mistake. Then he felt the rope go taut, 2 sharp tugs. He pulled back twice, acknowledging. Hannah's voice cut through the wind, barely audible. "Left! Go! Left!" He shifted direction, trusting her, and suddenly his hand hit wood. The pile. He'd overshot by maybe 5 feet, but they'd found it. They loaded their arms with as much as they could carry and fought their way back. The return trip was worse, weighted down, half blind, muscles already seizing from the cold. Elias's hands went numb around the wood, and he started to lose feeling in his feet. 3 steps from the door, he stumbled. The wood scattered. He went down hard, and the rope jerked tight. Hannah was there in seconds, hauling him up with strength he hadn't known she possessed. She didn't ask if he was hurt, didn't waste time on concern, just shoved him toward the cabin and grabbed the scattered wood herself. They tumbled through the door and slammed it shut behind them. For a long moment, they just stood there, shaking and gasping. Elias's hands were white and stiff, and Hannah's lips had gone blue. "Fire," she said through chattering teeth. "Now." They built it up fast, feeding in wood until the flames roared and heat began to spread. It took 20 minutes before Elias could feel his fingers again, and another 10 before the shaking stopped. Hannah sat close to the fire, arms wrapped around herself, face pale. That was stupid. That was necessary. Still stupid. She looked at him. "But thank you." "For what?" "Trusting me when you couldn't see." Elias rubbed his hands together, trying to work circulation back into them. "You kept us from dying. That's worth trusting." They sat in silence, thawing out, listening to the storm rage outside. Eventually, Hannah spoke again. "The other women, why'd they really leave?" The question caught Elias off guard. "Told you already?" "You told me reasons. I want the truth." He thought about lying, about deflecting, about all the ways he'd learned to protect himself from this exact conversation. But Hannah had just risked her life to save his, and that seemed to demand honesty. "They left because I didn't know how to be what they needed," he said finally. "They came here expecting partnership, expecting to build something together, and He stopped, searching for words. I'd been alone so long I forgot how to share space, how to compromise, how to care about someone else's comfort when survival was already hard enough. I worked them too hard, didn't talk enough, didn't know how to be gentle after years of only needing to be hard. And one by one, they realized they'd made a mistake choosing me. You think that's what happened? I know it is. Hannah shook her head slowly. You're wrong. How would you know? Because I've met men like you before, Elias. Men who think they're broken because life broke things around them. Men who mistake hardness for damage and silence for failure. You want to know why those women left? Why? Because they wanted easy, and you're not easy. They wanted a man who'd soften the world for them, and you can't even soften it for yourself. They wanted rescue, and you're barely surviving. That's not your fault. That's just what happens when people who don't fit together try to force it. Elias stared at her. And you think we fit? I think we're both too stubborn to quit, too damaged to expect perfect, and too tired to pretend we're anything other than what we are. If that's not fitting, it's close enough. The fire crackled between them, and outside the storm howled its endless fury. But inside, something warm and fragile was taking root. I don't know how to do this, Elias admitted quietly. Do what? This. Partnership. Caring about whether someone stays or goes. Neither do I. Hannah met his eyes. So I guess we learn together. The storm broke the next morning. They woke to silence. The first real silence in 3 days. And when Elias opened the shutters, the world outside was buried under 4 feet of fresh snow. Drifts had piled against the cabin walls, completely covering the lower half of the door, and the landscape had been transformed into something alien and beautiful. We're snowed in, Hannah said, coming to stand beside him. For a few days at least, until I can dig us out. Then we'd better get started. They spent the next week learning what survival really meant. Not the romanticized version where hardship builds character and struggle brings people together, but the grinding, exhausting reality of it. They dug. They rationed. They kept the fire going and the animals alive and themselves functional, and there was no space for anything except the work. But something had changed between them in that storm. Some barrier had come down. They talked more. Not about anything important, just the small observations that fill days when you're stuck inside with another person. Hannah told him about the boarding house in Denver where she'd worked, about the woman who ran it who'd taught her to cook and swear in the same breath. Elias told her about his father, about the year they'd spent building the barn, only to have it collapse in a spring flood. They learned each other's rhythms. Hannah woke early, but needed coffee before she was human. Elias was functional immediately, but crashed hard by evening. Hannah liked to read before sleep. Elias couldn't sleep if there was work left undone. They also learned how to fight. It started small, disagreements over how to ration supplies, whether to slaughter one of the chickens, how much wood to use. But it escalated fast because neither of them knew how to back down. We need to preserve the flour, Hannah said one morning, watching Elias measure out portions for biscuits. We need to eat. We need to eat for the next 2 months. That flour won't last if we use it like this. Then what do you suggest? Smaller portions. Make it stretch. We're already eating smaller portions. Any smaller, and we'll be too weak to work. And if we run out in 3 weeks, we'll be too dead to care. They stood there glaring at each other across the table, both stubborn, both convinced they were right. Finally, Elias set down the measuring cup. Fine. Your way. But when you're too hungry to split wood, don't come crying to me. I've never cried to anyone, and I'm not starting with you. The tension lasted all morning, both of them working in silence, neither willing to apologize. But by afternoon, when Elias checked the traps and came back empty-handed for the 3rd day in a row, they were forced to acknowledge the reality. Hannah had been right. They were running low on everything, and spring was still months away. We need to hunt, Hannah said that evening. Can't hunt in snow this deep. Game's denned up or moved to lower ground. Then we need to go to lower ground. That's a 2-day trip in good weather. In this, he gestured at the window where fresh snow had started falling again. Suicide. So we just sit here and starve? We survive, like we have been. For how long? Elias didn't have an answer. That night, Lying on his cot and listening to Hana move around in the next room, he felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his chest. For 6 years, keeping himself alive had been enough. If he failed, it only affected him. But now there was someone else depending on his decisions, and the stakes felt impossibly high. He must have made some noise because Hana appeared in the doorway. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Something like that." She came and sat on the floor near his cot, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" "How to keep us from dying." "We're not going to die. You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I know we've made it this far, and I know you're better at this than you think you are, and I know that panicking doesn't help." "I'm not panicking. You're doing that thing where you take all the weight yourself instead of letting me carry half. That's just slow-motion panicking." Elias turned to look at her. In the dim light from the banked fire, her face was half-shadowed, serious. "I've been doing this alone for 6 years," he said. "I know, but you're not alone anymore, so you need to stop acting like you are." "I don't know how." "Then learn. Same way you learned everything else on this mountain, by doing it wrong until you figure out how to do it right." She stood and moved back toward her room, pausing at the threshold. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "Tomorrow we make a plan together. Both of us. Not you deciding and me following. Together. All right?" He nodded, even though she probably couldn't see it in the dark. "All right." After she left, Elias lay awake for a long time, thinking about trust and partnership and all the things he'd convinced himself he couldn't have. The mountain wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, wolves called to each other across the frozen wilderness. But inside the cabin, for the first time in 6 years, Elias Vance didn't feel alone. And slowly, impossibly, he started to believe that might be enough. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of brutal brightness that made your eyes water. They sat at the table with the last of the coffee and took inventory of everything they had: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, 6 jars of preserves, half a sack of potatoes starting to sprout, a single chicken left. The mean Rhode Island red who'd outlasted all the others. 2 months till spring, Hana said, writing figures on a scrap of paper. Maybe longer if we get more storms. We will. Then we're looking at 10 weeks minimum. With current rations, we've got maybe 6 weeks of food. But the math was brutal and inescapable. We need meat, Elias said. I know, but you said hunting's impossible. In this weather, yeah. But if we get a clear span, 3-4 days, I could make it down to the lower valley. There's a meadow about 15 miles south where elk winter over. If I could get there, I could bring back enough meat to last us. 15 miles in snow? I've done it before. How long ago? 3 years. And you made it back alive? Obviously. Hana studied him, and he could see her working through the calculus of risk and necessity. Finally, she nodded. Then we wait for a break in the weather, and you go. But not alone. Hana, not alone, she repeated firmly. You take me, or you don't go. It's too dangerous. Starving is dangerous. Freezing is dangerous. You dying alone in a snowbank because there's no one to pull you out is dangerous. Taking me is practical. They locked eyes across the table, and Elias recognized the look on her face. It was the same expression she'd had when she told him she wasn't running, the same stubborn certainty that had kept her here through storms and scarcity and everything else that should have broken her. You ever fire a rifle? He asked. No. Ever track game? No. Ever field dress an elk? I'm guessing it's similar to a deer, which I've done twice, so no, but close enough. Despite everything, Elias almost smiled. You're impossible, and you're stuck with me, so teach me what I need to know or admit you need help. He could have argued, could have insisted, pulled rank, done any of the things that had driven the other women away. But Hana was right, she usually was, and he was tired of pretending he didn't need her. All right, he said, we'll go together, but we do it my way. Our way, she corrected. We decide together, remember? Our way, he agreed. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Elias taught Hana to shoot, starting with tin cans at close range and working up to longer distances. She was a terrible shot at first, flinching every time the rifle kicked, but she was stubborn and she learned fast. By the 3rd day, she could hit a target at 50 yards more often than not. Good enough to not shoot me by accident? Elias asked. Good enough to shoot you on purpose if you keep questioning my abilities. Fair. They packed supplies, dried food, extra ammunition, rope, a whetstone, flint and steel, blankets. Elias rigged a sled from old lumber to haul meat back if they were successful. They studied the sky every morning, watching for the break they needed. It came on the fourth day. Elias woke before dawn to perfect stillness. No wind, no snow, just cold, clean silence. He looked out the window and saw stars, sharp and bright, the kind of clarity that meant high pressure and stable weather. Hannah, he called quietly. It's time. They left an hour later, moving south by starlight. The snow was deep but packed firm enough to support their weight, and the sled pulled smoothly behind them. Elias led, breaking trail, with Hannah following in his footsteps. The first 5 miles were brutal. The terrain was steep, the cold unrelenting, and even with rest breaks every hour, Elias could feel exhaustion setting in. But Hannah kept pace without complaint, and when they finally stopped for a real rest at mid-morning, she was breathing hard but steady. How are you doing? Elias asked. Fine. Truth. She looked at him, and her expression was honest. Everything hurts, I'm tired, and I'm hungry, but I'm fine. Keep going. They kept going. By afternoon, they descended enough that the snow was shallower and the temperature had risen a few degrees. They found a sheltered spot under a rock overhang and made camp for the night, building a small fire and eating a cold meal. Tomorrow we reach the valley, Elias said, staring into the flames. If the elk are there, we hunt. If not, we turn back. And if we don't find anything, we make it work, same as always. Hannah was quiet for a moment, then, You ever think about what happens if this doesn't work? If we can't survive here? Every day. What would you do? I don't know. This is all I have. That's not true anymore, she said quietly. You have me now. That counts for something. Elias looked at her across the fire. This woman who'd appeared in his life like a miracle he didn't deserve and refused to disappear like he'd expected, and felt something crack open in his chest. Yeah, he said roughly. It does. They found the elk the next morning, a herd of maybe 30, wintering in the meadow just like Elias had hoped. They were wary, heads up and watching, but they hadn't scented the humans yet. Elias and Hannah moved into position slowly, circling downwind. Elias handed her the rifle. You want me to take the shot? She whispered. You've been practicing. Time to see if it stuck. What if I miss? Then I shoot. But you won't miss. Hannah settled into position, bracing the rifle against a fallen log. She was shaking, cold or nerves, probably both, but she controlled her breathing the way he'd taught her and sighted down the barrel. The shot cracked across the valley, sharp and final. The elk dropped. The rest of the herd scattered, disappearing into the trees in seconds. Elias and Hannah waited, making sure the animal wasn't going to get back up, and then they approached. It was a clean kill, one shot, right through the heart. I did it, Hannah said, sounding stunned. You did it, Elias confirmed. They spent the next 2 hours field dressing the carcass, working together to butcher the animal into manageable pieces. It was hard, messy work, but they had meat now, enough to last months if they preserved it properly. As they loaded the sled, Hannah turned to Elias. Thank you. For what? For trusting me with the shot, for bringing me, for treating me like a partner instead of a liability. Elias straightened, looking at this woman who'd somehow become essential to his survival in more ways than one. You earned it. Maybe, but you still had to let me try. They made it back to the cabin 2 days later, exhausted and frozen, but alive. The meat was everything they'd hoped for, enough to see them through to spring with careful rationing. They spent a week preserving it, smoking strips over the fire and packing others in snow. And somewhere in those long days of work, something solidified between them. Not love, not yet, but something deeper than partnership. A recognition that they were building something real, something that might actually last. One night, after the work was done and they were sitting by the fire, Hannah spoke. I'm staying, Elias. Not just for the winter, for good. If you'll have me. Elias looked at her, at this impossible woman who'd refused to give up on him even when he'd given up on himself, and nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll have you." Outside, the winter wind howled its endless warnings, and the mountain tested them with cold that could kill. But inside, two people who'd spent their lives alone had found something neither expected. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something worth fighting for. Spring came late that year, creeping up the mountain in reluctant stages. The snow melted in patches, revealing dead grass and mud underneath, and the creek that fed their spring turned from a trickle to a roar almost overnight. Elias and Hannah worked from dawn until they couldn't see anymore, repairing winter damage, planting what they could in soil that was still half frozen, and trying to rebuild what the cold had broken. The cabin had held, but just barely. They'd lost part of the roof on the lean-to, 3 fence posts had rotted through, and the chicken coop needed complete reconstruction after something, wolves or a bear, hard to say, had tried to dig its way in during February. "We need more lumber," Hannah said one morning, surveying the damage. "I know." "Which means a trip to town." Elias nodded. He'd been avoiding it, avoiding the questions and the looks and Morton Hayes's inevitable commentary, but they needed supplies they couldn't make or grow. Nails, mostly. Salt. Coffee, if they could afford it. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. "We'll go." He looked at her. In the months since she'd arrived, Hannah had changed in small ways. Her face had filled out slightly with regular meals. The permanent tension in her shoulders had eased, and she'd stopped flinching at sudden noises, but her eyes still carried that watchful quality, like she expected the world to turn on her without warning. "You don't have to," Elias said. "Town's not friendly." "Neither am I. I'll manage." They made the trip 2 days later, taking the mule and a list of necessities they'd argued over for an hour. Hannah wanted seeds for a proper garden. Elias wanted ammunition. They compromised on both, knowing it would mean going without other things. Clearwater Junction looked different in spring, still shabby, still small, but less hostile under sunshine. The mud was thick enough to swallow your boots, and the main street smelled like horses and wet wood, but there were people out, going about their business with the kind of energy that comes after a hard winter. They tied the mule outside Dalton's and went in together. Jack Dalton looked up from behind the counter, and his eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Well, I'll be damned. Vance? And Miss Cade. Didn't expect to see either of you till summer." "Needed supplies," Elias said shortly. "I can see that." Dalton's eyes flicked between them, clearly trying to read the situation. "You two make it through the winter all right?" "We're here, aren't we?" Hannah said. Dalton grinned. "That you are. That you are. What can I get you?" They went through the list, Dalton pulling items and tallying prices, while Elias mentally calculated whether they had enough credit. His grandfather had established an account here decades ago, and Elias had always been scrupulous about paying it down every fall after harvest. But last fall had been lean, and winter had eaten through most of what they had. "That's going to run you about $42, Dalton said when they'd finished. Elias felt his stomach drop. He had 30. Maybe 35 if he traded some of the elk jerky he'd brought. "I can pay half now," he said carefully. "Rest in the fall." Dalton's expression shifted, not unkind, but cautious. "Vance, you know I trust you, but I've got creditors too, and they're not as patient as I am. Can you make it 30 now and we'll call the rest a separate account?" Before Elias could respond, Hannah spoke up. "What if we trade work? I can help Vera with inventory, like I did before. Couple days' labor ought to be worth $12. Dalton looked surprised, then thoughtful. He called to his wife in the back room. "Vera, you still need help with that shipment that came in last week?" Vera Dalton appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Hannah, her face lit up. "Miss Cade, you're still here." "Still here," Hannah confirmed. "And you'd be willing to help sort inventory? I've been drowning in it since March." "Happy to." Vera looked at her husband, who shrugged. 2 days' work for $12 credit seems fair to me." "Then it's settled," Hannah said, like she'd just negotiated a business deal instead of bartering her labor for basic supplies. Elias wanted to argue. Wanted to say he'd find the money somehow, that she didn't need to work off his debts, but he also knew she was right. Pride was expensive, and they couldn't afford it. They loaded what they could take immediately onto the mule, and Hannah stayed behind to start working while Elias headed back to the cabin. He told himself it was only 2 days, that she'd be fine, that Clearwater Junction was safe enough and Vera Dalton was decent people, but the cabin felt wrong without her. He worked mechanically that afternoon, repairing fence posts and trying not to think about how quickly he'd gotten used to having someone else around. How much easier the work felt when there was someone to hand you tools or hold boards steady. How the silence felt oppressive now instead of natural. On the second day, he rode back to town earlier than necessary, telling himself he needed to check on the supplies, knowing it was a lie. He found Hannah in the back room of Dalton's store, surrounded by crates and covered in dust. She was working with Vera and 2 other women Elias vaguely recognized from town, all of them sorting through what looked like a catastrophic shipment of mixed goods. "This is insane," one of the women was saying, Mary Curtis, the schoolteacher. "Who packs dishes and farm tools in the same crate?" "Someone who wants broken dishes, apparently," Hannah said dryly, holding up a shattered plate. Vera sighed. "Mark it as damaged. We'll try to get credit from the supplier, but I'm not holding my breath." They worked in easy rhythm, the kind that comes from shared labor and common frustration. Hannah fit in with them seamlessly, trading comments and complaints like she'd been part of this town her whole life instead of an outsider who'd arrived in a snowstorm 4 months ago. Elias stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something complicated twist in his chest. This was what he couldn't give her: community, conversation, connection to people beyond just him. For 6 years, he'd told himself isolation was what he wanted, that the mountain was enough. But seeing Hannah laugh at something Vera said, seeing her belong somewhere even temporarily, made him wonder if he'd been lying to himself all along. "Vance!" Dalton's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You here to collect your wife?" The word landed strange. They hadn't formalized anything yet, hadn't had time to make the trip to the county seat where marriages were recorded, hadn't even talked about it beyond that one conversation months ago. But hearing someone else say it made it real, in a way it hadn't been before. "If she's finished," Elias said. Hannah looked up, saw him, and something in her expression softened. "Give me 10 minutes." She finished sorting the crate she was working on, said her goodbyes to Vera and the others, and met Elias outside. They loaded the rest of their supplies and started back toward the ridge. They'd made it maybe a mile when Hannah spoke. "You came back early. Wanted to make sure you were all right." "I was fine." "I know." They rode in silence for a while, the mule picking her way up the familiar trail. Then Hannah said, "You called me your wife." "Dalton did." "You didn't correct him." Elias didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was complicated. They'd been living as partners, building something together, but they'd never made it official. Never had the conversation about what they were to each other beyond people who'd agreed not to quit. "Does it bother you?" he asked finally. "No." She paused. "But we should probably make it legal if we're going to let people think it." "You want to get married?" "I want to make sure that if something happens to you, I have legal claim to this place, and vice versa." "Everything else?" She shrugged. "We're already doing anyway. Might as well have the paperwork to back it up." It wasn't romantic, wasn't even particularly affectionate, but it was honest and practical and very Hannah. "All right," Elias said. "Next trip to town, we'll see about making it official." "Good." They made it back to the cabin as the sun was setting, and Elias felt the rightness of it settle over him. The 2 of them, the mountain, the work ahead. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs, and that was enough. That feeling lasted exactly 3 weeks. Elias was working on the fence line when he saw the rider coming up the trail. Alone, moving carefully, clearly unfamiliar with the terrain. He set down his tools and waited, hand resting casual-like on the rifle he'd propped against the fence post. The rider was a man in his 40s, wearing a suit that marked him as someone from town. Real town, not Clearwater Junction. He sat his horse like he'd rather be anywhere else and pulled up about 20 feet from where Elias stood. "Elias Vance?" the man called. "That's right." "My name's Douglas Porter. I work for Rocky Mountain Development Company." Mind if I step down? Free country. Porter dismounted, smoothing his suit jacket and trying to look comfortable in a place that clearly made him nervous. Beautiful property you have here. It serves. I'm sure it does. Porter pulled a leather folder from his saddlebag. Mr. Vance, I'll get straight to the point. Rocky Mountain Development has been acquiring land in this region for a water rights project, and your property includes a spring that's essential to our plans. Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. The spring's mine. Has been for 60 years. Well, that's actually complicated. Porter opened the folder, pulling out papers covered in dense legal text. Water rights in Wyoming are governed by prior appropriation doctrine, which means— I know what it means, Elias interrupted. First in time, first in right. My grandfather filed claim to that spring in 1868. There's nothing prior to that. Porter's smile was patient, patronizing. Actually, there is. We've done extensive research, and we've found documentation of a claim filed in 1867 by a prospecting company that was working this area. They filed for water rights to all natural springs within a 5-mile radius, which includes yours. That's impossible. I have the documentation right here. Elias took the papers, scanning them. The legal language was thick and confusing, but the dates were clear. 1867, a year before his grandfather's claim. And the signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Silas Hartwell, representing Mountain West Mining Consortium. This is bullshit, Elias said flatly. There was no mining company working this ridge in 1867. If there had been, my grandfather would have known about it. Nevertheless, the claim exists and is legally binding. Rocky Mountain Development purchased the rights from Mountain West's successor company last year, which means we now control water access from that spring. The hell you do. Porter's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Vance, I understand this is frustrating, but the law is clear. We own the water rights. However, we're willing to offer you a very reasonable lease agreement. For $500 a year, you can continue accessing the spring for domestic and agricultural use. $500. Elias didn't make $500 in a good year, let alone a bad one. It might as well have been $5,000. And if I can't pay, he asked, already knowing the answer, then I'm afraid you'll need to find another water source, or— Porter paused delicately. We'd be willing to purchase your land outright. Fair market value, of course. Fair market value for land that can't access water is nothing. We're prepared to offer $1,500 for the entire property. $1,500 for 160 acres that his grandfather had died for, that his father had worked himself to death maintaining, that Elias had poured 6 years of his life into keeping. It was an insult wrapped in legal paper. Get off my land, Elias said quietly. Mr. Vance, get off my land. Porter gathered his papers carefully, mounted his horse, and turned to leave. At the edge of the clearing, he paused. You have 30 days to decide, Mr. Vance. After that, we'll be forced to take legal action to enforce our rights. I'd suggest you hire a lawyer. He rode off, leaving Elias standing there with rage and fear warring in his chest. Hannah found him an hour later, still standing by the fence line, staring at nothing. What happened? She asked. He told her, all of it. The claim, the lease, the impossible choice between paying money they didn't have or losing everything. When he finished, Hannah was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Let me see the papers. They went inside and spread the documents across the table. Hannah read through them slowly, her expression growing darker with each page. This is fraud, she said finally. Prove it. The dates don't make sense. Mountain West Mining Consortium, I've heard that name before. They went bankrupt in 1869 after a scandal involving false claims. They were filing paperwork on land they'd never worked, selling rights they didn't own. How do you know that? I worked in a mining camp in the Dakotas, remember? This kind of thing happened all the time. Companies would file bogus claims, then sell them to speculators who'd use them to extort actual settlers. It's a scheme. Even if it is, how do we prove it? Hannah was quiet, thinking. Then, we need the original claim records. If this is fake, there will be something wrong with it. Wrong signatures, wrong dates, wrong filing location, something that proves it's not legitimate. Those records would be in Cheyenne, at the territorial office. Then we go to Cheyenne. Elias shook his head. That's 2 weeks' travel minimum, and even if we find proof, We'd need a lawyer to fight it in court. We can't afford any of this. Then we find a way. Hannah's voice was steel. Because I didn't survive a winter on this mountain just to let some companies steal it out from under us. Hannah, no. She stood, facing him across the table. You want to give up? Fine. Sign their papers, take their money, and walk away. But I'm not doing that. This place is ours. We earned it, and I'm not letting them take it without a fight. Elias looked at her. This woman who'd promised she wouldn't run, who'd kept that promise through everything the mountain threw at them, who was now ready to fight a battle they couldn't win just because it was the right thing to do. And something in him shifted. For 6 years, he'd been waiting for failure, expecting it, preparing for it. Every woman who left had confirmed what he already believed. He was meant to lose things. But Hannah was different. She didn't accept defeat as inevitable. She looked at impossible situations and found ways through them. Maybe it was time he started doing the same. All right, he said, we fight. Over the next week, they made plans. Hannah would go to Cheyenne. She was better with paperwork and records, and she had experience dealing with bureaucrats from her years working in various offices. Elias would stay and keep the homestead running, maintain their presence on the land, and make sure Rocky Mountain Development didn't try anything while she was gone. They pooled every penny they had. It came to $43, enough for stagecoach fare and maybe a week's room and board in Cheyenne, but not much else. It's not enough, Elias said, staring at the pile of coins and crumpled bills. Hannah was quiet. Then she stood and went to her room, returning with the small wooden box she'd brought with her from town, the one she'd never opened in his presence. She set it on the table and flipped the latch. Inside were papers, official documents with seals and signatures, and underneath those a bank certificate. What is this? Elias asked. My mother's inheritance. She left it to me when she died, but my father controlled it until I turned 21. By the time I could claim it, he'd remarried and I was gone, so I never went back for it. I just left it there, in a Boston bank, because I didn't want anything from him. How much? $1,200. Maybe more, with interest. Elias stared at her. $1,200 was a fortune. Life-changing money. Why didn't you tell me? Because it didn't matter. I came here to work, not to buy my way in, and I didn't want you thinking I was using you to hide from my past. But you're willing to use it now? To save this place? Yes. She met his eyes. This is my home now, Elias, worth fighting for, worth spending money I never wanted in the first place. If we do this and lose, we lose everything. Your inheritance, the land, all of it. Then we'd better not lose. 2 days later, Hannah left for Cheyenne. Elias drove her down to Clearwater Junction in the wagon, and they waited together for the eastbound stage. Neither of them talked much. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't been said already. When the stage pulled up, Hannah turned to him. I'll be back in 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if the records are hard to find. Be careful. Always am. Hannah, she waited. Thank you, Elias said quietly. For staying, for fighting, for all of it. Something in her expression softened. She reached up and touched his face, just briefly, the first deliberately affectionate gesture she'd made in all the months they'd been together. See you in 3 weeks, husband. Then she climbed aboard the stage, and Elias watched it disappear down the road, carrying away the only person who'd ever chosen to stay. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Elias's life. He worked from sunup to sundown, throwing himself into every task he could find. He repaired the entire fence line, rebuilt the chicken coop, cleared brush from around the cabin, and started work on expanding the garden plot. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spinning through all the ways this could go wrong. On the 10th day, Douglas Porter came back. Mr. Vance, he called from the edge of the clearing, I'm here to check on your decision. You said I had 30 days. That was 2 weeks ago. You have 16 days left. Then come back in 16 days. Porter's expression hardened. Mr. Vance, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but my company has invested significant resources in this project, and we need access to that water. If you're not willing to negotiate, I'm not. Then we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action. And I should warn you, fights like this rarely go well for individual landowners. The courts tend to favor established companies with proper documentation. Get off my land, Porter. This is your last chance to settle this reasonably. Elias picked up the rifle, leaning against the porch post. He didn't point it at Porter, didn't need to, just held it casual, letting the man draw his own conclusions. Porter left, but 3 days later, a sheriff's deputy arrived with papers, a summons to appear in court in Rawlins to answer Rocky Mountain Development's petition for water rights enforcement. Elias read through the documents, his gut sinking with every line. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. He had no lawyer, no money for one, and no idea how to fight this. All he had was the hope that Hannah would find something in those records that could save them, and the growing, terrifying certainty that hope might not be enough. He was feeding the chickens on the 21st day when he heard the wagon coming up the trail. His heart kicked in his chest. Too early to be Hannah, unless something had gone wrong, and he grabbed the rifle before heading to meet whoever it was. But it was her. Hannah climbed down from a hired wagon, looking exhausted and dusty, and carrying a leather satchel bulging with papers. The wagon driver helped unload her trunk, accepted payment, and headed back down the mountain. Elias stood frozen, just staring at her. "Well?" Hannah said. "You going to help me with this trunk or just stand there?" He crossed the clearing in 3 strides and pulled her into a rough embrace. She went stiff for a moment, surprised, then relaxed against him. "I found it," she said quietly. "I found proof." They spread the documents across the table, copies of original claims, filing records, correspondence between territorial offices. Hannah had traced the entire history of the Mountain West Mining Consortium claim, and she'd found exactly what she was looking for. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a claim form dated 1867. "This is supposed to be the original filing, but see the signature? Silas Hartwell. Except Silas Hartwell didn't exist. I found death records. There was a Silas Hartwell who died in 1864 in a mining accident in Colorado, 3 years before this claim was supposedly filed. Someone forged his signature? Someone created an entire fake company, filed false claims on land they never worked, and sold those claims to speculators. Rocky Mountain Development bought the rights from a company called Western Holdings Corporation, who bought them from another company, who traced back to Mountain West. But Mountain West never legally existed. The whole thing is built on fraud." Elias felt hope flare in his chest, dangerous and fierce. "This is enough? To fight them in court?" "It should be, but we still need a lawyer who's willing to take the case, and we need to file a counterclaim before the court date." "Which is when?" 4 weeks from now. They had 4 weeks to find a lawyer, build a case, and fight a company with resources they couldn't match. It should have felt impossible. But looking at Hannah, at the evidence she'd gathered, at the fierce determination in her eyes, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. He felt like they might actually win. "Then we'd better get started," he said. Hannah smiled, a real smile, full of the kind of dangerous optimism that had kept her alive through everything the world had thrown at her. "Yeah," she agreed. "We'd better. Finding a lawyer in Wyoming who'd take on Rocky Mountain Development Company turned out to be harder than finding proof of fraud. The first one they tried, a man named Hutchins in Rawlins, listened to their story for exactly 10 minutes before shaking his head. "I won't touch it. Rocky Mountain's got half the territorial legislature in their pocket, and the other half's too scared to cross them. You take this to court, you're going to lose, and I'm not going to be the one holding the bag when you do." The second lawyer, a woman named Catherine Morse, who'd opened practice in Cheyenne after her husband died, was more sympathetic but equally pessimistic. "Your evidence is compelling, but proving fraud against a company this size requires resources you don't have. They'll bury you in motions and continuances until you run out of money or patience. I'm sorry, but I can't help you." The third lawyer didn't even let them finish explaining before showing them the door. By the time they left the fourth office, a man who spent 20 minutes explaining why they should just take Rocky Mountain's offer and move on, Elias was ready to put his fist through something. They stood on the street in Rawlins, surrounded by strangers and the noise of a town that didn't care about their problems, and Elias felt the familiar weight of defeat settling over him. "We're done," he said quietly. "No one's going to take this case." Hannah was reading through a newspaper she'd picked up from the general store, not really paying attention to him. "There's one more." "Hannah, Says here there's a lawyer named Samuel Brennan who just moved to Laramie from Denver. Opened an office last month, specializes in land disputes and water rights. He'll say the same thing the others did. Maybe, but we're going to ask anyway. She folded the newspaper and looked at him. We came this far. We're not quitting now. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that sometimes knowing when to quit was the smartest thing you could do. But Hannah had that look on her face, the same stubborn certainty she'd had when she told him she wasn't running, when she'd insisted on going to Cheyenne, when she'd shot that elk in the valley. So he followed her to the stagecoach station, and they bought tickets to Laramie. Samuel Brennan's office was above a saddle shop on 2nd Street, accessible by a narrow staircase that creaked ominously with every step. The door at the top had his name painted on the glass in fresh black letters, and when they knocked, a voice called out, "It's open!" Brennan was younger than Elias expected, maybe 35 with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much injustice and not enough justice. His office was sparse, just a desk, 2 chairs, and shelves half filled with law books that looked like they'd been well used. "Help you?" he asked, not looking up from the brief he was writing. "We need a lawyer," Hannah said, "and we heard you might be the only one willing to listen." That got his attention. Brennan set down his pen and gestured to the chairs. "Sit. Tell me what you've got." They told him everything: the homestead, the spring, Rocky Mountain Development's claim, the evidence Hannah had found in Cheyenne. Brennan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "You know what you're asking me to do?" he said, finally. "Fight a company with more money and power than we'll ever have," Elias said. "Yeah, we know. And you understand that even with this evidence, there's no guarantee you'll win?" "We understand." Brennan tapped his pen against the desk, thinking. Then, "I left Denver because I was tired of watching big companies steamroll people who couldn't afford to fight back. I came here thinking maybe Wyoming would be different, but it's not. Same corruption, different mountains. So I made myself a promise. I'd take one case a year that mattered, even if it meant not getting paid, even if it meant losing." "And this is that case?" Hannah asked. "This is that case." Brennan stood and extended his hand. "I'll represent you. But I need you to understand something. Rocky Mountain's going to fight dirty. They're going to try to intimidate you, discredit you, make you wish you'd never filed this suit. And if we win, they're going to appeal. This could take years." "How many years?" Elias asked. 2, maybe 3 if they drag it out. Elias looked at Hannah. 3 years of legal battles, of uncertainty, of fighting. 3 years of not knowing if they'd get to keep the home they'd built. Hannah met his eyes and nodded once. "Then we fight for 3 years," Elias said. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for court. Brennan worked them hard, drilling them on testimony, teaching them how to present themselves, how to answer questions without getting defensive. He reviewed every piece of evidence Hannah had gathered, building their case piece by careful piece. "The key is establishing that Mountain West never had a legitimate claim to the water," Brennan explained one evening, papers spread across his desk. "If we can prove the company was fraudulent from the start, then every subsequent sale of those rights is void. Rocky Mountain's claim collapses." "And if the judge doesn't see it that way?" Hannah asked. "Then we appeal, and keep appealing until we find a judge who does." The night before the hearing, Elias and Hannah stayed in a boarding house in Rawlins that smelled like old tobacco and mildew. They lay in the dark, in a bed that wasn't theirs, listening to strangers moving around in other rooms. "You scared?" Hannah asked quietly. "Terrified." "Me too." Elias turned to look at her, barely visible in the darkness. "What happens if we lose?" "We find another way." "There might not be another way." Then we make one." Her voice was soft but certain. "We didn't come this far to give up now. I don't know how you do it." "Do what?" "Keep believing. After everything, your father, the years of running, all of it. How do you still believe things can work out?" Hannah was quiet for a moment, then, "Because the alternative is giving up, and I'm not built for that. My mother gave up. Let my father break her down until there was nothing left. I watched her disappear a little more every day, and I swore I'd never be like that. So I don't give up, even when I should, even when it'd be smarter. I just keep fighting because it's the only thing I know how to do. Elias reached out in the darkness and found her hand. She laced her fingers through his and held on tight. "We're going to win this," she said. "Yeah," Elias agreed, trying to believe it. "We are." The courtroom was smaller than Elias expected and more crowded. Rocky Mountain Development had brought 3 lawyers, all of them in expensive suits, all of them carrying leather cases full of documents. Douglas Porter sat behind them, looking smug and certain. Brennan sat alone at their table, with Elias and Hannah on either side of him. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Them against the machine, David against Goliath. Except this wasn't a story, and there were no guarantees. Judge Franklin Carver entered, and everyone stood. He was an older man, weathered and stern, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. He settled into his chair, surveyed the courtroom, and called the session to order. "We're here on the matter of Rocky Mountain Development Company versus Elias Vance, regarding water rights to the spring on Mr. Vance's property. Counselors, make your opening statements." Rocky Mountain's lead attorney, a man named Whitfield who spoke like every word was worth $1, stood and laid out their case. The claim was clear, he argued. Mountain West Mining Consortium had filed proper documentation in 1867. Rocky Mountain had purchased those rights through legitimate channels. The law was on their side, and Mr. Vance's attempt to deny them access was not only illegal, but damaging to a project that would benefit the entire region. He spoke for 20 minutes, smooth and confident, painting Elias as an unreasonable man standing in the way of progress. Then Brennan stood. "Your Honor, this case isn't about progress or regional benefit. It's about fraud. Mountain West Mining Consortium never existed as a legitimate entity. The claim they filed was signed by a dead man. Every subsequent sale of those rights was built on that fraudulent foundation, which means Rocky Mountain Development's claim is void. We have documentation proving all of this, and we ask the court to dismiss their petition and affirm Mr. Vance's rightful ownership of his water rights." Whitfield's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He hadn't expected them to have actual evidence. The judge looked at both lawyers. "I'll hear arguments. Mr. Whitfield, you may present your case." For the next 2 hours, Whitfield presented Rocky Mountain's documentation, pristine copies of claims, sales records, corporate filings. Everything looked legitimate on the surface, exactly the kind of paperwork that would convince a judge who didn't look too closely. Then Brennan stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Whitfield, you've presented a claim filed in 1867 by Silas Hartwell on behalf of Mountain West Mining Consortium. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "And you're asserting this claim is legitimate?" "Absolutely." Brennan pulled a document from his stack. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a death certificate for Silas Hartwell, issued in Colorado Territory in 1864, 3 years before he supposedly signed this claim." The courtroom went quiet. Whitfield recovered quickly. "That could be a different Silas Hartwell. It's not an uncommon name." "Perhaps, but I also have territorial records showing no business license was ever issued to Mountain West Mining Consortium. No tax records, no incorporation papers, no evidence this company existed in any legal capacity. That doesn't prove. I also have correspondence from the Territorial Surveyor's Office stating that no mining activity was ever documented in the region where Mountain West claimed to be operating." Brennan laid document after document on the judge's desk. "In fact, there's no evidence Mountain West Mining Consortium ever existed except for this single claim form signed by a dead man." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "Even if there are irregularities in the original claim, Rocky Mountain purchased these rights in good faith. Good faith requires due diligence, Counselor. Did your client investigate the legitimacy of these claims before purchasing them?" "We relied on the documentation provided." "Documentation you're now admitting might be fraudulent." "I'm not admitting anything." Judge Carver held up a hand. "Gentlemen, Mr. Brennan, do you have additional evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have affidavits from 3 separate land surveyors who've reviewed the original claim and found discrepancies in the legal descriptions. I have testimony from the current territorial records clerk confirming that multiple fraudulent claims were filed in the 1860s and later used to extort legitimate settlers. And I have Mr. Vance's original homestead filing from 1868, which was accepted without contest because there were no valid prior claims on the property. He laid it all out, piece by piece, building a wall of evidence that Rocky Mountain couldn't climb over. By the time he finished, Whitfield looked rattled, and Porter looked furious. The judge reviewed the documents in silence for what felt like an hour. Then he looked up. "I'm going to take this under advisement. Court will reconvene in 3 days for my ruling. Until then, Mr. Vance retains access to the disputed water source." The gavel came down, and it was over. Elias sat frozen, not sure what had just happened. Brennan gathered his papers, his expression carefully neutral. "Did we win?" Hannah whispered. "Not yet. But we didn't lose." Brennan stood. 3 days. We'll know in 3 days. Those 3 days were the longest Elias had ever lived through. They stayed in Rollins, too anxious to make the trip back to the cabin, too restless to do anything but wait. Hannah read the same book 3 times without retaining a word. Elias wore a path in the boarding house floor with his pacing. On the morning of the 3rd day, they returned to the courthouse. The room was less crowded this time, just them, Brennan, the Rocky Mountain lawyers, and a handful of spectators who'd heard about the case and come to watch the outcome. Judge Carver entered, and everyone stood. He settled into his chair, arranged his papers, and looked out over the courtroom with that same unreadable expression. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented," he began, "and I've given considerable thought to the arguments made by both sides. This is a complex case involving questions of water rights, historical claims, and the legal doctrine of good faith purchase." Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "However," Carver continued, "the evidence presented by Mr. Brennan raises serious questions about the legitimacy of the original Mountain West claim. The discrepancies in dates, the lack of supporting documentation, and the irregularities in the filing itself are too significant to ignore." Whitfield shifted in his seat. "Furthermore, I find that Rocky Mountain Development Company failed to exercise appropriate due diligence when purchasing these rights. A reasonable investigation would have uncovered the same irregularities Mr. Brennan found. Therefore, I cannot in good conscience allow a claim built on such a questionable foundation to supersede Mr. Vance's legitimate homestead rights." Elias stopped breathing. "It is the finding of this court that the original Mountain West Mining Consortium claim is invalid due to fraud. All subsequent sales of those rights are therefore void. Rocky Mountain Development Company's petition is denied, and Mr. Elias Vance's water rights are hereby affirmed and protected." The gavel came down. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Hannah made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and grabbed Elias's arm hard enough to bruise. "We won," she whispered. "We actually won." Brennan was shaking their hands, smiling for the first time since they'd met him. "Congratulations. You just beat one of the biggest companies in Wyoming." Across the aisle, Whitfield was gathering his papers with barely controlled fury, and Porter was already heading for the door, presumably to report the loss to his superiors. They'd won. Against all odds, against money and power and every advantage Rocky Mountain had, they'd won. Outside the courthouse, in the bright morning sunlight, Elias pulled Hannah into a rough embrace. She wrapped her arms around him and held on like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. "I told you we'd win," she said against his chest. "You did. You didn't believe me. I believed you. I just didn't believe in us." She pulled back to look at him. "And now? Now I'm starting to." They stood there on the courthouse steps, 2 people who'd come from nothing and survived everything, and for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt like something they could build instead of something they had to endure. But the celebration was short-lived. 2 weeks later, back at the cabin, they received notice that Rocky Mountain Development was appealing the decision to the Territorial Supreme Court. And along with the appeal came something else. A letter, unsigned, slipped under their door in the middle of the night. Elias opened it at breakfast and felt his blood run cold. "What is it?" Hannah asked. He handed her the letter. It was short and direct. "Drop your claim or face consequences. You won a battle, not a war. Accidents happen in the mountains." Hannah read it twice, then set it down carefully. "They're threatening us." "Yeah. What do we do?" Elias thought about it, about backing down, about taking whatever settlement Rocky Mountain might offer now, about choosing safety over principle. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But he looked at Hannah, at the cabin they'd fought so hard to keep, at the land his grandfather had claimed and his father had died for, and he knew there was only one answer. "We keep fighting," he said, "and we watch our backs." Over the next months, strange things started happening. Fence posts were cut in the night. The chicken coop was vandalized. Someone took shots at their barn, high enough to miss, but close enough to be a message. They reported it to the sheriff, who took notes and did nothing. He was sympathetic, he said, but without proof of who was responsible, there was nothing he could do. "It's Rocky Mountain," Hannah said after the third incident. "They're trying to scare us off." "It's working," Elias admitted. "No, it's not." She loaded the rifle with steady hands. "Because we're not leaving. They can break our fences and shoot at our barn and leave threatening letters, but we're not leaving. Someone could get hurt. Someone could, but we've faced down winter storms and starvation and legal battles. We can face down this too." Elias wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that bravery and bullets were different things, but she was right. They'd come too far to quit now. So they fortified. Elias set traps around the property line, not to hurt anyone, just to give warning if someone approached. They took turns on watch at night. They kept the rifle loaded and within reach at all times, and they waited for the appeal to work its way through the courts. 6 months later, they got their answer. The Territorial Supreme Court upheld Judge Carver's ruling. Rocky Mountain's appeal was denied, and the company was ordered to pay restitution for legal fees and damages. It was over. Really over. The harassment stopped immediately. No more cut fences, no more shots in the night. Rocky Mountain development moved on to easier targets, and Elias and Hannah were left alone to rebuild what had been broken. But something had changed between them during those months of fighting. They'd gone from partners to something deeper, people who'd stood together against everything the world could throw at them and refused to break. One evening, sitting by the fire after a long day's work, Elias spoke. "We never did make it official." "What?" Hannah looked up from her mending. "The marriage. We said we'd do it, make it legal. Never got around to it. We were a little busy fighting for our lives." "Yeah, but we're not now." Hannah set down her mending. "You proposing, Elias Vance?" "I guess I am." "Why now?" He thought about how to put it into words, about how she'd fought for this place like it was hers, how she'd stood beside him when running would have been easier, how she'd made him believe in things he'd thought were dead inside him. "Because you chose to stay," he said finally, "and I want to choose you back. Officially." Hannah's eyes were bright in the firelight. "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard." "It's the only one you're getting." "Then I guess I'll take it." They married a month later in Clearwater Junction, with Vera Dalton as witness and Jack Dalton standing in as the officiant since the town still didn't have a preacher. It was a brief ceremony, practical and unsentimental, exactly what they both wanted. Afterward, Vera pulled Hannah aside. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said, smiling. "Elias Vance married, and to a woman who can actually stand him." "Someone has to," Hannah said. "He's different now. Since you came, lighter, somehow, like he remembered how to be human." "He just needed someone who wasn't afraid of the mountain." Vera laughed. "Honey, you're not afraid of anything." That wasn't true, Hannah thought. She was afraid of plenty, of losing what she'd found, of the world taking away the first real home she'd ever had, of Elias realizing she wasn't worth the fight. But she didn't say any of that, just smiled and thanked Vera and went back to her husband, who was standing awkwardly by the wagon, looking like he wanted to be anywhere but the center of attention. They drove back to the cabin in comfortable silence, and when they arrived, Elias carried her over the threshold. Not because it was tradition, but because the front step was icy, and he didn't want her to slip. That night, lying together in the darkness, Hannah spoke quietly. "Thank you for not giving up." "On what?" "On this. On us. On believing we could win." "I didn't believe. You did. I just followed your lead." "Well, thanks for following." Elias pulled her closer. "Thanks for leading." Outside, the wind howled down from the ridge like it always did, carrying winter on its back. But inside, wrapped in blankets and each other's warmth, Elias and Hannah felt something neither had experienced in longer than they could remember. They felt safe. Not because the world had become less dangerous or because the mountain had gotten less harsh, but because they'd found someone who refused to leave no matter what came. And in the end, that was worth more than any court ruling or legal victory. It was worth everything. The restitution money from Rocky Mountain Development arrived in early spring, $800 in a bank draft, delivered by a courier who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Elias stared at it for a long time, not quite believing it was real. "That's more money than I've seen in 6 years," he said quietly. Hannah took the draft from his hands and studied it. "It's not enough for what they put us through, but it's enough to build something better." They spent 2 days arguing about how to use it. Elias wanted to pay down their debt with Dalton, stock up on supplies, and save the rest for emergencies. Hannah wanted to expand the homestead, build a proper barn, improve the cabin, maybe buy a second cow and some sheep. "We survived on almost nothing," Elias argued. "Why risk it now?" "Because surviving isn't the same as living," Hannah shot back. "We fought for this place. Now we build it into something worth the fight." In the end, they compromised. Half went to practical necessities and debt. The other half went into improvements that would make the homestead not just survivable, but sustainable. They hired 2 men from Clearwater Junction to help build a proper barn, one with walls that didn't leak and a loft for hay storage. It took 3 weeks of hard work, and by the time they finished, Elias's back was screaming and his hands were covered in splinters, but the structure stood solid and square, better than anything his grandfather had built. "It's beautiful," Hannah said, standing in the doorway and looking at the clean new wood. "It's a barn. It's our barn. That makes it beautiful." They bought 3 sheep, scraggly things that cost too much but would provide wool and eventually meat. The second cow turned out to be ornery and difficult, but she gave good milk, and between her and Bess they had enough for their own needs and some to trade in town. Hannah expanded the garden, turning over soil that had never been cultivated and planting vegetables she'd learned about from Vera Dalton. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, beans, things that could grow in the short mountain summer and store through the long winter. By midsummer, the homestead looked different. Not prosperous, it would never be that, but solid, like a place people intended to keep. One evening, sitting on the porch they'd rebuilt to actually be level, Hannah spoke. "I'm pregnant." Elias had been whittling a new handle for the axe, and the knife slipped, nearly taking off his thumb. "What?" "Pregnant. With child. Going to have a baby." She said it matter-of-factly, but there was something underneath, nervousness maybe, or fear. "How long have you known?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. Elias set down the knife, his mind reeling. A child. Here, on this mountain, in this life they'd barely managed to secure for themselves. It should have terrified him, the responsibility, the danger, the 1,000 ways it could go wrong. But looking at Hannah, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes, all he felt was a fierce protective surge of something he couldn't name. "Are you—" he started, then stopped. "How do you feel about it?" "Scared," she admitted. "I've never done this before, never even thought I would. And having a baby up here, so far from a doctor—" "We'll manage." "You don't know that." "No, but we've managed everything else so far." Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother died in childbirth, the baby too. I was 12 when it happened, and I watched her slip away over 3 days because my father was too cheap to pay for a proper doctor." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That won't happen to you." "You can't promise that." "I can promise I'll do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't. And so will you. We'll plan, we'll prepare, and when the time comes, we'll get you to a doctor if we have to carry you down this mountain on a sled." She looked at him, and some of the fear in her eyes eased. "This wasn't part of the plan." "Nothing's been part of the plan. We've been making it up as we go since the day you arrived. And look how that's turned out," Hannah said, gesturing at the homestead around them. "Barely surviving, constantly fighting, living on the edge of disaster." "We won, Hannah. Against the winter, against starvation, against a company that should have crushed us. We won. And we'll win this too." She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They sat there as the sun set over the ridge, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. 2 people who'd never expected to build a future discovering they were about to create one. The pregnancy was hard, Hana was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down, exhausted by noon every day. Elias took over more of the work, pushing himself harder to make up for what she couldn't do. She hated it, hated being dependent, hated feeling weak, but her body didn't give her a choice. By the 4th month, the sickness eased and she started to show. A small swell under her work dress that grew steadily bigger as summer turned to fall. They made preparations. Vera Dalton came up to the homestead twice, bringing supplies and advice, teaching Hana what to expect and what to watch for. "You need to be in town a month before your due date," Vera said firmly. "I've helped deliver 6 babies, and I'm not letting you try this alone up here." "We can't afford to leave the homestead for that long," Hana protested. "Then Elias stays here and you come to town, but you're not having this baby without help, and that's final." Hana looked at Elias, who nodded. "Vera's right. When the time comes, you go to town." "And leave you here alone?" "I survived 6 years alone. I can survive 6 weeks." But as fall deepened and Hana's due date approached, neither of them could stand the thought of being apart. So they compromised again. They'd both go to town in late November, Hana to stay with the Daltons, Elias to find work to pay for their room and board. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best they had. The first snow came early that year, a vicious storm in mid-October that dumped 2 feet overnight and trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Hana was 7 months along by then, moving slowly, her back aching constantly, and Elias watched her with growing anxiety. "You're staring," she said one morning, catching him watching her struggle to pull on her boots. "I'm concerned." "I'm fine." "You can barely bend over." "That's what pregnancy does. I'll be fine." But that night she woke him with a gasp of pain, her hand pressed to her stomach. "What's wrong?" Elias was up instantly, lighting the lamp with shaking hands. "I don't know. Something feels—" She gasped again, doubling over. Terror flooded through him. "We need to get you to town. Now." "We can't. It's dark. The trail's covered in snow." "I don't care. We're going." He wrapped her in every blanket they had, hitched the mule to the wagon in record time, and started down the mountain in the middle of the night. The trail was treacherous, barely visible under the snow, and every jolt of the wagon made Hana whimper with pain. It took 4 hours to reach Clearwater Junction, 4 hours of Elias praying to anything that would listen that they'd make it in time, that Hana would be all right, that he wouldn't lose her to the same fate that had taken her mother. Vera Dalton took one look at Hana and got her inside, calling for hot water and clean cloths. Jack Dalton pulled Elias aside. "Could be false labor," he said quietly. "Could be the real thing. Either way, she's in good hands now." Elias sank onto a chair and put his head in his hands. He'd faced down storms and starvation and legal battles without breaking, but this was different. This was Hana's life, and the life of their child, and he was completely powerless to protect either of them. 3 hours later, Vera emerged from the back room. "She's all right," she said, and Elias could breathe again. "False labor, brought on by stress and the rough ride down. The baby's fine too. But she needs to stay here now, Elias. No more trips up that mountain until after the birth." "She'll stay," Elias said immediately. "Whatever she needs." He stayed in town for 2 days, sleeping on the floor of the Dalton store, checking on Hana every hour until she finally told him to go back to the homestead before she strangled him for hovering. "The animals need you," she said, "and I need to know the place is being looked after. I'll be fine here." "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Go." So he went, riding back up the mountain alone, and the cabin felt emptier than it had even in those 6 years before Hana arrived, because now he knew what it was like to share it with someone, and going back to being alone felt like losing something essential. He threw himself into work, repairing everything that needed repairing, hunting to build up their meat stores, making sure the homestead would be ready for when Hana came back. When they came back, him and Hana and the baby, who would make them a family instead of just 2 damaged people trying to survive together. 6 weeks later, on a clear December morning, a rider came up the trail with a message. Hana had gone into labor. Elias made it to town in half the time it usually took, pushing the mule harder than he should have, his heart pounding with fear and hope, and everything in between. He found the Daltons' house in chaos. Vera barking orders, Mary Curtis, the schoolteacher, helping with hot water. and from the back room the sound of Hana's voice, strained and exhausted but fighting. "You can't go in there," Vera said when Elias tried to push past her. "The hell I can't." "Elias Vance, you will sit down and wait like every other father in the history of childbirth, or so help me, I will throw you out of this house myself." He sat. The next 4 hours were the longest of his life. He heard everything: Hana's cries of pain, Vera's encouraging voice, the moment when everything went quiet, and Elias was sure something had gone terribly wrong. Then a baby's cry split the air, thin and outraged, and Elias stopped breathing. Vera emerged 10 minutes later, smiling and exhausted. "You have a daughter, and Hana's asking for you." Elias was inside that room before Vera finished the sentence. Hana was propped up in bed, pale and sweating and more exhausted than he'd ever seen her, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up when he entered, and despite everything she'd just been through, she smiled. "Meet your daughter," she said quietly. Elias crossed to the bed and looked down at the baby in Hana's arms. She was small, impossibly small, with dark hair and a face scrunched up in irritation at the world she'd just been forced into. "She's perfect," Elias whispered. "She's loud," Hana corrected, "and demanding, and she already hates being told what to do. Wonder where she gets that from. You going to hold her or just stand there?" Elias had held newborn calves and lambs, had cradled injured birds and handled fragile things, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of his daughter in his arms. She was so light, so fragile, and looking down at her sleeping face, he felt something crack open inside him, a wall he'd built so carefully over 6 years of isolation, demolished in an instant by this tiny human who didn't even know he existed yet. "What do we name her?" he asked. Hana was quiet for a moment, then, "Clara, after your third bride, the one you said seemed promising." Elias looked at her in surprise. "Why?" "Because if she hadn't left, I never would have come. And I want our daughter to carry a reminder that sometimes the things that feel like failure are actually just making room for what's supposed to happen." Elias felt his throat tighten. "Clara Vance. I like it." "Good. Because I'm too tired to argue about it." They stayed in town for 2 weeks while Hana recovered. Vera wouldn't hear of them leaving any sooner, and truthfully, Elias was grateful for the help. He had no idea what he was doing with a baby, how to hold her, feed her, change her, stop her crying, and having Vera there to teach him kept him from complete panic. But eventually, it was time to go home. They made the trip in early January, moving slowly, the wagon packed with supplies and Clara bundled against the cold. Hana sat beside Elias, holding their daughter, and despite the freezing temperature and the treacherous trail, she looked content. "You ready for this?" Elias asked. "Raising a child up here?" "I'm ready for anything, as long as I'm doing it with you." They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, and Elias carried both Hana and Clara inside, refusing to let either of them walk through the snow. The cabin was cold. He'd banked the fire before leaving, but it had gone out days ago, and he quickly got it burning again while Hana settled Clara into the cradle he'd built during his lonely weeks alone. That night, lying in bed with Hana beside him and Clara sleeping in her cradle nearby, Elias felt something he'd never expected to feel in this cabin, on this mountain, in this life. He felt complete. Not perfect. Their lives would never be perfect, and the mountain would never stop testing them, but complete. Like all the broken pieces of himself had finally found a way to fit together. "I love you," he said quietly. Hana turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her face. "You've never said that before." "I know, but it's true." "Why now?" "Because now I understand what it means. It's not just wanting someone around, or needing them, or being grateful they stayed. It's looking at the life we've built and knowing I'd rather have this, the struggle, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it, than have anything else without you." Hana's eyes were bright in the firelight. "I love you too. Even though you're stubborn and impossible and you still can't cook worth a damn. I'm learning." "You're trying. There's a difference." They lay there in the darkness, listening to their daughter's soft breathing, and felt the weight of everything they'd survived settle over them, not as burden, but as proof. Proof that they were stronger than they'd believed. Proof that choosing to stay was worth it. Proof that sometimes the hardest paths led to the best destinations. The years that followed weren't easy. Nothing about mountain life ever was. But they were good. Clara grew from a tiny, fragile baby into a loud, fearless toddler who climbed everything and feared nothing, much to her parents' constant terror. She took her first steps chasing the chickens and spoke her first word, no, at 10 months, wielding it like a weapon against bedtime and vegetables and anything else she didn't approve of. She's just like you, Elias told Hannah one afternoon, watching Clara refuse to come inside despite the snow falling. She's exactly like you, Hannah countered. Stubborn as a mule and twice as mean when she doesn't get her way. That's your influence. I'll accept responsibility for the stubbornness. The meanness is all Vance. They expanded the homestead further, building a second room onto the cabin for Clara, improving the irrigation from the spring, adding more livestock. It was slow progress, paid for with sweat and careful saving, but every improvement made their lives a little easier, a little more sustainable. Other homesteaders started appearing in the region. People who'd heard about Elias and Hannah's fight against Rocky Mountain development and saw it as proof that the little guy could win. They'd stop by for advice, for help, for the comfort of knowing they weren't alone in trying to carve lives out of unforgiving land. Elias, who'd spent 6 years avoiding human contact, found himself becoming something he never expected, a member of a community. Not a large one. The nearest neighbors were still 3 miles away. But enough. Enough that when someone needed help raising a barn, people showed up. Enough that when illness struck, neighbors brought food. Enough that Clara grew up knowing she was part of something bigger than just her small family on their isolated ridge. On Clara's 3rd birthday, Hannah and Elias stood on their porch, watching their daughter chase the sheep through the meadow, laughing and fearless and completely at home in this hard place. "You think she'll stay?" Hannah asked quietly. "When she's grown, or will she leave for somewhere easier?" "I think she'll choose whatever life makes her happiest," Elias said. "Same as we did. We didn't choose this place. You were born to it, and I was running to it. No, we chose to stay. That's different than just ending up somewhere." Hannah leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her. 8 years since she'd stepped off that stagecoach in a snowstorm. 8 years since she'd looked at this broken man and this brutal mountain and decided they were worth the fight. "You ever regret it?" Elias asked. "Answering that ad? Coming here?" "Every time Clara refuses to sleep and I'm awake at 3 in the morning wondering what I was thinking," Hannah said. Then more seriously, "No, never. This is the first place I ever felt like I belonged. The first time I built something instead of running from something. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even for a life in town, with neighbors close by and a real doctor and stores. Especially not for that. That life was killing me slowly. This one," she gestured at the homestead, at Clara, at everything they'd built. "This one makes me want to keep living." That summer, Samuel Brennan came to visit, making the trip from Laramie to see how his former clients were doing. He stayed for dinner, charmed by Clara's chatter, and impressed by how much the homestead had grown. "I've been following up on the Rocky Mountain case," he told them over coffee. "Turns out you weren't the only ones they tried to extort. After your case, 3 other homesteaders came forward with similar claims. We're building a class action suit." "Will it go anywhere?" Elias asked. "Already has. Rocky Mountain Development dissolved last month. Couldn't survive the scrutiny. The company's assets are being liquidated to pay restitution to everyone they defrauded." Hannah set down her coffee cup carefully. "How much restitution?" "For you? Based on the harassment, the legal fees, and the documented damages to your property, probably around $2,000. The number hung in the air, impossible and real." "What would you do with $2,000? Brennan asked, genuinely curious. Elias and Hannah looked at each other, having a full conversation without words. Then Elias turned to Brennan. "Build a real house. Big enough for Clara to have her own room and for us to maybe have another child without tripping over each other. Put in a proper well so Hannah doesn't have to haul water from the spring every day. Maybe buy a bull, start a real cattle operation instead of just surviving year to year. And send Clara to school," Hannah added, "when she's old enough. Even if it means building a small cabin in town for the winter months so she can get a proper education." Brennan smiled. "Those are good plans, practical. I'll let you know when the money comes through." It took another year for all the legal proceedings to finish, but when the settlement money finally arrived, it was more than they'd hoped. $2,800, payment for years of harassment, and the acknowledgement that what had been done to them was wrong. They used it exactly as they'd planned. Built a 4-room house to replace the cabin, with real windows and a wood floor and a fireplace that drew perfectly. Drilled a well closer to the house, bought breeding stock for cattle, and set aside money for Clara's education, locked in a bank account where they couldn't touch it even if times got hard. By the time Clara turned 6, the homestead was unrecognizable from the struggling, barely surviving operation it had been when Hannah arrived. It was prosperous, not wealthy, but solidly successful, the kind of place that could support a family and weather bad years without catastrophe. And Hannah was pregnant again. Apparently we're doing this twice, she told Elias when she was certain. You scared? Less than last time. I know what to expect now. That should make it worse, not better, she laughed. You'd think, but at least this time I know I can survive it. Their son was born in the spring, an easy delivery that lasted only a few hours and left Vera Dalton declaring that Hannah had been made for childbirth. They named him Thomas after Elias's father, and he was everything Clara wasn't: quiet, careful, thoughtful. Between Clara's wildness and Thomas's caution, they might average out to normal, Hannah joked, or they'll drive us completely insane trying to manage both extremes. That too. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and victories. Drought one summer, a bumper harvest the next. A winter so mild they barely used half their firewood stores, followed by one so brutal they lost 2 head of cattle. Clara learning to read and then teaching herself advanced mathematics from books Vera Dalton ordered special. Thomas discovering he had a gift for working with animals, able to calm even the most temperamental livestock. And through it all, Elias and Hannah grew older together, their bodies wearing down from the hard work, but their partnership growing stronger. They'd learned each other completely, knew when to push and when to yield, when silence was comfort and when it was avoidance, how to fight without breaking, and how to forgive without forgetting. On their 10th anniversary, counted from the day Hannah had arrived, not the day they'd legally married, they stood together at the edge of their property, looking out over everything they'd built. You remember what you told me? Elias asked. That first night when I tried to scare you off? You said I wouldn't last a week. You said you'd prove me wrong. I did prove you wrong. Yeah. He took her hand, rough and calloused from a decade of work, perfect in its imperfection. You did. You ever think about those other women? Hannah asked. The ones who left? Sometimes, wondering what their lives turned out like. Think they're happy? I hope so. They made the right choice for themselves. This life isn't for everyone. But it's for us. Yeah, it's for us. They stood there as the sun set over the ridge, painting the sky in familiar colors. 2 people who'd started as strangers and become something unshakable. Behind them, in the house they'd built with settlement money and stubbornness, their children were arguing about something. Clara insisting they needed to explore the far meadow, Thomas arguing it was too close to dark. It was loud and chaotic and imperfect, and Elias wouldn't have traded it for anything. We did good, he said quietly. We did, Hannah agreed. We really did. 15 years after Hannah had stepped off that stagecoach into a Wyoming snowstorm, the homestead had become something neither Elias nor his grandfather could have imagined. Not just a place to survive, but a place to thrive. A working ranch with cattle and sheep, a house full of life and noise, and land that was finally, legally, irrevocably theirs. Clara was 17 now, preparing to leave for college in the fall, a teacher's college in Cheyenne, where she planned to study mathematics and education. She'd come back, she promised, but they all knew promises made at 17 were different than the ones made at 25. The world would call to her, offering opportunities the mountain couldn't match, and Elias and Hannah had made peace with that. If she comes back, it'll be because she chooses to, not because she has to, Hannah said. That's better. Thomas, at 13, showed no interest in leaving. He'd already claimed the South Pasture for his own experimental breeding program, convinced he could develop cattle that thrived in high altitude better than anything currently available. He's going to be insufferable if he's right, Hannah said, watching him work with the young calves. He learned from the best, Elias replied, and Hannah elbowed him in the ribs. They were sitting on the porch of the house, their house paid for with money they'd won by refusing to give up, watching the sun set over land they'd fought to keep. Elias was 50 now, his hair gone mostly gray, his back perpetually sore from decades of hard work. Hannah was 43, with lines around her eyes from squinting into the sun, and hands that would never be soft again. They'd earned every scar, every ache, every reminder that this life demanded everything you had, and then some. And they'd won. Not because everything had been easy, or because luck had favored them, or because they'd been rewarded for their virtue. They'd won because they'd refused to quit, because when faced with impossible choices, they'd chosen each other. Because when the world tried to take everything, they'd held on with both hands and fought back. "You think it's over?" Hannah asked quietly. "The fighting?" "No, there'll always be something. That's what living means." "Good. I'd be bored otherwise." Elias laughed and pulled her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat there as darkness fell over the mountain. Two people who'd survived everything the world could throw at them. Two people who'd proven that sometimes choosing to stay was the bravest thing you could do. And in that moment, in that place they'd built from nothing, Elias Vance finally understood something he'd spent years trying to learn. He'd never been a man no one would stay for. He'd just been a man waiting for the right person to arrive. And when she had, he'd been smart enough to let her prove him wrong. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of another winter, another test, another year of surviving and building and growing. But Elias and Hannah weren't afraid. They'd faced worse and won. They'd stood together against isolation and starvation and companies with more power than they'd ever have. And they were still standing, still fighting, still choosing each other every single day. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The stars came out over the ridge, sharp and brilliant in the thin mountain air. And somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. Claire was inside helping Thomas with his schoolwork, arguing about mathematics in the way only siblings could. The cattle were settled in the barn, safe and healthy. The land stretched out around them, harsh and beautiful, exactly as unforgiving as it had been when Elias's grandfather first claimed it. But it was theirs now, in a way it had never been before. Not just legally, but earned. Paid for with sweat and stubbornness, and the kind of love that only grows in hard places, between people who choose to stay when leaving would be easier. "Thank you," Elias said quietly. "For what?" "For answering that ad, for getting off that stagecoach, for being too stubborn to run when you should have. You already thanked me for that. I'll probably thank you for it every year until I die. That's a lot of thanking." "You're worth it." Hannah smiled in the darkness, and Elias felt her hand find his, their fingers lacing together with the ease of a decade and a half of practice. "Yeah," she said softly, "we both are." And on that mountain, in that moment, with everything they'd built surrounding them and everything they'd survived behind them, Elias and Hannah Vance sat together in the darkness and knew, with absolute certainty, that they'd found exactly what they'd been searching for all along. Not perfection, not ease, not a life without struggle or pain, but a home, a partner, a reason to keep fighting. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.